Greetings! We are here at our first biannual Research Rumble. I am your host, Omri, here with Black Researchers United. I am joined by a very special guest. This is none other than Brother Dwayne Wong Omowale. He is a published author. He is a Pan-Africanist at heart. A very solid brother, a scholar, someone who knows what research is all about. This Research Rumble is a discussion about a very important subject. A subject which does not get a lot of attention nowadays, but however, one that is very essential. The subject of this debate, or rather this discussion, as it will take the form today, is on African participation and resistance during the time of the slave trades. The question for today, the main question for this third round of our Research Rumble is, the question for today is how did traditional systems of servitude in African societies differ from the forms that were practiced in other communities and by other people around the world? That is the question for today. So once again, our question is, how did traditional systems of servitude in Africa, practiced by African people, differ from those practiced in other communities? So, as we begin our rumble tonight, I'm going to invite Brother Dwayne to go ahead and introduce yourself, Brother Dwayne, for our viewers. Just let them know, who you are. Just give us a little background about yourself, what it is that you do. Maybe some of the things that inspired you along this path of research, along this journey, and also if you can share with us some of the references that went into your research for the present question of our Research Rumble.
Thank you. As you said, my name is Dwayne Wong Omowale. I'm an author, a Pan-African activist, and a researcher. I currently published 21 books. And the thing that inspired me to really engage in this research and to engage in writing about African history is the fact that I don't think our history is as accessible and available as it should be. So when I realized this, it put me on the path of not only wanting to know as much as I can about African history, but writing about it and publishing that writing to share that information with others. So that definitely has been the main driving force behind why I've written and published so many books on African history. Now, in terms of resources as it relates to this particular topic, and I'll get into this more as the discussion unfolds. What I find interesting about this topic is that typically it's approached from a very Eurocentric perspective. And what I mean by that is usually this topic is dealt with from the perspective of Europeans, Westerners, people who not only profited from the slave trade, but have a vested interest in portraying the slave trade in such a way that it downplays the severity of how the slave trade impacted Africa's development, and also the severity of how brutal slavery really was, particularly when we talk about slavery on the plantations in the Americas. So for me, the sources that I look at when I think about this topic and when I approach researching a topic like this would have to be the perspective of African people themselves. I think typically when we look at topics relating to the history of African people, very often the voices of African people, the voices of the people who were directly impacted by these issues are ignored or written out of the narrative. So for me, when I think of looking at the sources, I go directly to African people. What did the Africans who had to experience the slave trade, who had to experience slavery, what were their views on the matter? And one of the things that I'm sure we'll get to in this discussion is this idea that I see coming up often about how when we look at history, we shouldn't judge history based on our modern day perceptions, a modern day understanding of morality. And typically, I've seen that argument come up as a defense for the slave traders. I've seen people say, "Well, Thomas Jefferson was this great, founding father in American history. He was a great revolutionary, a great president." And the defense of him, because he was a slave trader, a slave owner on top of everything else. So the defense of him being a slave owner is we shouldn't judge Thomas Jefferson based on our modern understanding of slavery and human rights and morality. And it's, that type of argument. And my counter to that would be, that's fine. Let's judge him by the standards and the morality of his day. And one of the things that we'll get to in this discussion is the fact that Africans did have a conception of human rights, a conception of basic humanity. So when we look at that particular, if you like, in African society view issues like servitude and people being in bondage compared to how it was treated in the United States and the rest of the Americas in terms of how were enslaved Africans on the plantations treated. So to me, I think it's very important to go back to those sources, not only because it provides the African perspective and the African voice on these issues, but it also puts everything in a proper perspective. So as I said, we're not looking at these issues necessarily from our own modern day perceptions and understandings. We're looking at these issues as they were playing out at the time. How did African people feel about these issues at the time that they're happening? What were the perceptions at the time? So I want to establish that before we get into the discussion, because I think a lot of the listeners and people who are familiar with this type of topic would have probably heard some of these talking points, because that's the typical narrative that I think is put out there to justify the European role in the slave trade, and to, as I said, downplay how impactful this was for African people, not only Africans in the diaspora who were enslaved, but I think the actual impact of the slave trade in Africa is also very severely downplayed. So these are all the topics that I hope we'll get to in the discussion tonight.
Yes, brother Dwayne. This is this is amazing. It's so great to have you join us tonight as we discuss this very important topic: African participation and resistance in the time of slavery. Now, of course, we're dealing with a very specific period in history. A lot of people, like you said, Brother Dwayne, they have some ideas about, well, the thinking was different, the ethics, the logic, the way the society was, structured. Everything was different. But as you rightfully pointed out, Brother Dwayne, we have to recognize that the people who lived in this time period, both in the Western world, and also on the continent in Africa, these are people who came from societies that were, well established over long periods of time. In regards to the West in particular, it's not that there was an absence of morality, right? That certainly was there, but it's important for us to take a closer look at some of the dynamics of these societies. In our first discussion, in our first Rumble, round one, the question that we addressed was, did African people sell other Africans into slavery? That was the question that we addressed. And joining us for that discussion, we had Brother Adam Myrie, another published author and someone who is very much solid with his research. We had a very good discussion, and I shared some books, as I will do tonight. Some of those books that I shared, first off, when we talk about whether African people sold other African people into slavery, it's also important for us to acknowledge that there's a history before slavery, before the slave trades, right? There was a time when Africa was at a certain point in its history in terms of development, And over the course of the trade, over the course of that history, there was a process which took place that was very much putting African people at a disadvantage. So we addressed some of those as we mentioned some of these books. There's a book here, Great Rulers of the African Past. This is a very good book on the topic of Africa and the status of societies in Africa during this history. There's a book, The Destruction of Black Civilization by Chancellor Williams. This one is a classic, very important book for, I think, all of us to read. Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. This is a landmark text on the subject. Capitalism and Slavery, Eric Williams' book. Very, very important book to have. I have another book here. This is a primary source record. It's called Slave Testimony. It has 2 centuries of letters, speeches, interviews, and autobiographies by persons who were formerly enslaved. Some of these narratives discuss what life was like on the continent of Africa and what took place on the slave ships as they traveled into the Americas. So this gives us a good insight, I think, into the topic that we're discussing today, which is, of course, how the systems of servitude traditionally in African societies were different from what the African people experienced when they arrived in the New World. There's some other texts here that I'd like to share. These are more so in regards to our last discussion, round 2. The subject of round 2 was, did African people do enough to resist enslavement? Okay, so we had a number of texts here which were addressing the topic of resistance. This book here by Stella Dadzi, A Kick in the Belly. This talks about the role of women in the resistance struggles during the period of slavery. This is actually a excellent book here. Just some writings and speeches by Toussaint Louverture, who was the leader of the revolution in Haiti. This is an important text, Counter Life, Slavery After Resistance and Social Death by Christopher Freeberg. A lot of times when we talk about resistance, as it was pointed out during our previous discussion, we think about the revolutions, we think about the rebellions, we think about the mass struggles where people really came together and said, let's tear down the system and let's burn down the plantations and let's form our own government. But we a lot of times tend to overlook the fact that there were these subtle, everyday instances in which African people resisted enslavement even while they were under brutal oppression. So this is a very good book. We spoke with Brother Abba, who is a Maroon from the island of Jamaica. Brother Abba, he was talking to us about the resistance struggles from the Maroon communities. The Maroons, of course, were African people who escaped the plantations. They formed their own communities. They defended them with their lives. And so that's a very important aspect of this topic. This is the book Maroon Heritage. It gets into that. If you ever have the time, I would highly recommend that book. This book here, Facing Racial Revolution, Eyewitness Accounts of the Haitian Insurrection. It's a very good book to have. And 2 final books on that subject. There's a book here, Disease, Resistance, and Lies. The Demise of the Transatlantic Slave Trade to Brazil and Cuba. So this book, of course, deals with Latin America. And here's another book, Caribbean Slave Revolts and the British Abolitionist Movement. So this is talking about the revolts that took place in the British colonies. So both of these texts, why are they important? They demonstrate that it was not simply, abolition did not simply come because the politicians in England, places like England and France, and um, and even in the Americas, decided that, yeah, let's just end slavery. Let's just end the slave trade. It was more than that. These books demonstrate that the resistance struggles, the movements from below, were basically the impetus for the abolition of the slave trade and of slavery itself as a system of oppression. All right. And finally, I just have a few other books here. This is a book called The Atlantic Slave Trade: Effects on Economies, Societies, and Peoples in Africa, the Americas, and Europe. We have to understand slavery, even though this history that we're discussing here, this was at a certain period of time, some of the structures continue today that were established during this point in time. There are still some effects that we're experiencing in the present: social effects, economic effects, political effects, psychological effects. Okay? And it's very important that we understand this. We can look at some other texts here. For example, there's a text called The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. She does a very good job at demonstrating the link between that history and the present inequalities that we experience in the Western world today. We have this book here as well, The Death Gap. This talks about how some of the effects of that history continue in the form of health disparities, in the form of what this book, of course, is titled The Death Gap, which is, life expectancy. Just how long does a person of African heritage in places like the United States live compared to people who are of other backgrounds? Okay, so again, these are just some references in case there's anyone out there who's listening and they'd like to get their hands on, some sources where they can explore these topics further. So, Brother Dwayne, did you have any references or source materials that you'd like to share which have helped to build or to develop the research that you have done on this subject?
I don't have to think about that because there's so many different sources. One of my books, Muhammad Ali, The Confederate Flag, and Other Essays, that has 2 chapters that deal specifically with this topic. And anyone who looks at that book will see the reference pages is very dense. There's a lot of different material. So I'm struggling to really think of something off the top of my head that I think would be particularly useful. I know you mentioned Walter Rani, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. I think his book, A History of the Upper Guinea Coast, that's, to me, that was very eye-opening in terms of how he deals with slavery in that particular, slavery and the slave trade in that particular region of West Africa. What I find particularly interesting is he shows in that book there were actually certain parts of that region in West Africa where there wasn't slavery until the Europeans got there, and then the Europeans actually introduced an indigenous system of slavery. There's another one, African Voices in the Atlantic Slave Trade by Anne Bailey. I think that's another one that I would mention. Oh, you read it?
That's a good one.
Yeah,
I have not read it, but I've been looking into that book, and I think it's certainly a treasure.
Yeah. Definitely from the perspective of African people, and in that book, Anne Bailey really looks at the African viewpoint of the slave trade. And what I find particularly interesting is the use of oral history as a means to collect that information, because what that means is that Africans, as the slave trade was going on, Africans were recording what was happening orally and then passing these stories on through the generations. So
Mm-hmm.
why I find that fascinating is that we in the diaspora tend to think of that history from the perspective of our ancestors who were enslaved on the plantations. And in that book, Anne Bailey shows that Africans have their own perception of that incident in history. So they look at it from the perspective of having many of their ancestors being kidnapped and shipped over seas. Just the feeling of fear and
Right.
there are no kidnaps because that was the reality of what was going on during that period. People being kidnapped, could be gone neighbors, loved ones could be gone. I think that would be a great book as well to read on this particular topic, just because it goes into the African perspective, the continental African perspective of the slave trade. But as I said, I've done so much different research on this topic that it would be very difficult to narrow down from books that I have to go back and check.
I see. Yes, yes. This is great. I love it, Brother Dwayne. Uh, you know, based on that information that you're sharing there, Brother Dwayne, it seems that I myself have a lot of reading to do. I've studied this subject for quite a while, but there's still so much to learn, so much to learn. And you, Brother Dwayne, I think have done an excellent job in terms of research, in terms of trying to put together some answers, on these inquiries that we have. And so I think it's very good that we can have you here, Brother Dwayne, to be able to share some of your knowledge. And once again, everyone, Brother Dwayne, he has written some books. I'm gonna just show some of them here. We have this text here. This is called One Caribbean and Other Essays. And there is another text here. I think this is probably my favorite. It's called Essays Towards Restoring the African Mind by yours truly, Brother Dwayne Wong Omowale. So, we are going to take a short break. When we return, we will get right into it. Again, our question for tonight, it is, how did traditional systems of servitude in African societies differ from those practiced in other communities? Once again, you're watching our first biannual Research Rumble. Stay tuned. Welcome back, everyone, to our first biannual Research Rumble. I am your host, Omri with Black Researchers United. I'm joined here today by Brother Dwayne Wong Omowale, Pan-African writer and researcher, someone who's really studied this topic that we are going to be discussing today. The subject of our Research Rumble is African participation and resistance in the time of the slave trades. So, when we started out, Brother Dwayne, he introduced himself. He told us a little about his background. He told us about some of the references that have gone into his research on this subject. We're going to be addressing a very important question this evening. So, without further ado, let's get right into it. Brother Dwayne, I'm just gonna throw the question at you. Our main question, which is, how did traditional systems of servitude in African societies differ from those that were practiced in other communities by other people? It could be, in other parts of the world. Could be at other times in history. Going back into ancient times. Some of the classical civilizations. We can also address some of those in comparison with the African systems as well. So, Brother Dwayne, the question again is, how did traditional systems of servitude in African societies differ from those that were practiced in other communities?
Yeah, so at the beginning, I want to mention, for me, I'll be centering this discussion particularly around how traditional systems of servitude or slavery in Africa differed with Europe, because as I mentioned earlier, I think, when we talk about this topic, we're obviously focusing on the European slave trade and how that impacted African people globally, both on the continent and in the diaspora. So when I look at the history, to me, I think the most glaring difference would obviously be how the slave or the servant was actually treated. So when we look at the European society, particularly Greece, ancient Rome, those societies, those were slave societies. Slaves made up a significant portion of the population, and slaves also were a significant part of the economic structure of Greece and Rome. And those were what we call chattel slave societies. And by chattel slave, I mean that enslaved people were treated as chattel. They were treated as property. They weren't treated or viewed as human beings. And in contrast to the type of systems of servitude that we find in African societies, I think generally speaking, African societies did recognize the humanity of people who were in bondage. One example I will give of this is the Karakan Fuga, which was the I guess you can call the constitution, the traditional constitution of the Mali Empire. And this is a very fascinating document for those who haven't read it. And one aspect of that, I find particularly striking when we talk about this topic was that the Karakan Fuga actually had a provision which stipulated that slaves shouldn't be treated poorly. There was a recognition of the basic humanity of a slave. And when we contrast that with Greece and Rome, as I said, those were societies where if you were a slave, you were property. A slave master could mistreat you, could beat you, even kill you without any type of recourse, because you were the property of the slave master. And that type of system that we see in Greece and Rome, that type of chattel slavery in which an enslaved person is reduced to a piece of property, that's the type of slavery that was transferred to slave societies in the Americas. When I talk with slave societies in the Americas, I'm talking about the slave plantations in North America, South America, Central America, and the Caribbean islands. And as I said, the Constitution of Mali had a provision in place to ensure that slaves were given basic humane treatment. They couldn't be mistreated, which would mean that they couldn't be overworked, couldn't be beaten, certainly couldn't have been murdered without a just cause.
Right.
And in preparing for this discussion, I actually wanted to back looked at a particular case which I covered in one of the books that I've written. And this case was State v. Mann. It's a case out of North Carolina in 1829. And the reason why I wanted to mention this and why I wanted to contrast this with the Kurukan Fuga's provision on slavery is that this court case was essentially, it was treated as a property case. This was a situation in which a person had hired a slave to work for that individual for a period of a year. Now, the person who hired the slave wasn't the actual owner. So what happened was, as I said, this person had hired a slave to work for a year. And during the course of utilizing that slave's labor, the particular individual man, the person who was at the center of this case, had assaulted the slave. So as the court is looking at this particular case, the court isn't addressing it as a typical assault and battery case. The court is looking at it as a property case, and the court actually applied the principle of bailment. Bailment is a legal principle in which the rightful owner of a piece of property transfers possession to another individual. Now, in this situation, it's just the possession that's being transferred, but the rightful owner still retains ownership over that property. So what the court was looking at here is in a bailment case involving a slave. If I transfer possession of my slave to another individual and that individual assaults my slave, are they in their legal rights to do so? And what the court ruled was yes, because part of the transfer of possession means the transfer of the ability to use a slave the way a slave is used. And the court actually points out that beating a slave might be a necessity for someone who is relying on a slave, because obviously beating the slave is not only one way to compel a slave to engage in labor, but it's also a way to keep the slave in line so that the slave wouldn't revolt. And the reason why this case stood out to me is, imagine the court is looking at an assault and battery case from the perspective of a piece of property being assaulted and battered. The court is not looking at the slave in this particular instance as a human being. And as I said, that's striking, because that shows what the laws in the United States were at the time regarding enslaved individuals, and to contrast that with a West African society, which did have certain provisions in place, to protect the basic humanity of enslaved individuals. And when we talk about this topic, I think it's important to understand that, obviously any type of system of bondage and servitude does involve a level of repression, a level of coercion on the part of the master, enslaving another individual. So I think I want to say as well that we have to be very careful in engaging in these topics. And one of the things that we certainly don't want to do is to overlook the fact that these systems of servitude in Africa could be very inhumane in certain aspects, could be very brutal in certain aspects, but generally speaking, the humanity of the enslaved individuals was recognized. The Home, for example, definitely stands out as an example of one of those African societies that could be very inhumane and brutal in terms of how enslaved individuals were treated. Part of this was it was a product of the fact that the Home was a very militarized African society. The Home rose during the period of the slave trade in West Africa. So being a militarized state was a necessity for the Home and for other kingdoms in that region to be able to survive the onslaught of the slave trade. Because when we're talking about West Africa during the slave trade, this was essentially a war zone. This is constant war, this constant raiding, and that's the sort of thing. So states like the Home and Asante, which I'll mention as well during this discussion, they had to become very militarized, very aggressive, and very brutal in some of the ways they conducted their business just to be able to survive. Because the fact is, many kingdoms didn't even survive the onslaught of the slave trade. So in the Home, one of the practices that was engaged was a ritual of sacrificing captives to deceased kings. It was a form of ancestral veneration in which they would slaughter these people. And the sacrifice of enslaved individuals not only served as a means to appease the ancestors, but it was a show of the Home's power. It was essentially sending a signal to other rival kingdoms in the region that we're so powerful that we could raid villages and capture people and execute these people in a mass
Wow.
ritual. So it served that role
Wow.
as well. And I said this is very brutal and inhumane, but at the same time, the Home were in the home, if for example, if you were a captive in war, typically what the homie did to enslave people who weren't sacrificed and who weren't sold into slavery, these people would the society, they were, the families that own these people, they were viewed as being part of that family in a way that wasn't done in the Americas. So I make this point to say that, as I said, we should be careful when we make these comparisons, not to brush over the fact that slavery in certain African societies can be very brutal, but at the same time, of African societies such as the Home, there still was a basic recognition of the humanity of enslaved individuals. As I said, in the Home, people who were enslaved were gradually integrated into society in a way that we didn't see in the Americas. And another thing that really stands out to me when we make these comparisons is the fact that not only were enslaved people in African societies integrated into society, but very often they reached positions of power which we typically don't see in the slave plantations in the Americas.
Right.
Take for example, Jaja of Akubo. He was a very wealthy West African king. He started out as a slave and he worked his way up. Eventually earned his freedom. He became a very wealthy and powerful king until the British exiled him. Another example, I mentioned Mali earlier, but here's another example of the type of function of slavery in Mali. Sakura was one of Mali's most powerful rulers, and he was also a slave. Even though he was a slave, he was a very prominent military commander, and he was able to position himself in such a way that he was able to seize power in Mali and become a ruler. And we also find examples of the children of enslaved individuals also becoming powerful rulers. Menelik II, who most people who are familiar with African history will know him, the leader of Ethiopia who defeated the Italian army and was the only African escape being colonized by actually successfully defeating the colonizing European power. And he was the child of a slave. His mother was a slave. Atiba was a ruler of the Oyo kingdom in Nigeria, and he was another very prominent and powerful ruler in his time, and he was born of enslaved mothers. So across Africa, we see examples of people who were slaves rising to positions of power, becoming rulers, and people who were the offspring of slaves rising to positions of power and becoming rulers. And then when we contrast that to slavery in the Americas, obviously we don't find a single example in the United States of someone who was a slave or the offspring of a slave becoming the president of the country. That certainly was not even a possibility. Likewise, in the Caribbean as well, we don't find examples of a slave or the offspring of slaves rising to the highest position of society. So to me, what that demonstrates is that within African societies, there was a level of social mobility for enslaved individuals that we don't find in the Americas. And obviously the reason for that was because slavery in the Americas, not only was it chattel slavery, which reduced the enslaved individuals to being property, but it was a racialized type of slavery, and it was organized in such a way that because you were of African descent, because you were Black, you were automatically treated as inferior by the society. And what happened was, it didn't even matter if you were enslaved or freed. I mentioned the State v. Mann case. Another case I can mention here is the Dred Scott case, in which the Supreme Court held that Black people in the United States, free or enslaved, didn't have equal rights of citizenship. They basically ruled that a Black person, even a free Black person who's not a slave, was not a full citizen and didn't have the same rights as a white American.
Right, and then there was also the Three-Fifths Compromise, which essentially stated that, these people were not even 100% human, in a sense. Symbolically, but even then it was still very much something that was in the minds of a lot of Americans during this time.
Yeah, and that's why I started off by mentioning the Constitution in Mali, because when you contrast that Constitution with what the American legal system was stating in terms of how enslaved people were viewed, and as I said, it wasn't even just enslaved people. Became racialized to the point where if you were black, you didn't have equal rights regardless of your status, whether you were free or enslaved. And this created a type of situation where it was simply impossible for someone to work their way out of slavery and to work their way up to being the highest position in American society. And that was very much a contrast from how slavery in Africa was viewed, where that was a situation in which even if you were enslaved, you could still work your way out of slavery. You could still work your way to a particular position.
Right.
And I think that's
Right.
very important to
And
consider when we
also
talk about
and also I would argue based on my research this was the case in in parts of the East, for those African people that were transported across the Indian Ocean or taken across the Sahara into what is considered now to be like the Arab world, or also the Muslim world. Places like Iran, Iraq, places like again towards the East India, and Southeast Asia. In these societies, I would argue that there was still that sense of a upward mobility, as a person was what's the word, integrated into the society, and a lot of times this was from a religious based standpoint, where it was that you had to declare yourself to be a follower of Allah. You had to declare yourself to be a Muslim. That was, most of the time the way up the social ladder. But still, compared, like you said, compared to what we see in the Americas and in places like the United States and places like you can say places in the Latin American countries as well, in places like Brazil and Cuba, and in the Caribbean, this was just simply not the case. You wouldn't see a situation in which a person who had been formerly enslaved could rise to the rank of a president, right? A mayor, a constable, etc. You can go on and on and on down the line. In the United States, in particular, of course, all the way up to Lincoln's presidency, you had a president, Abraham Lincoln, who basically said that we don't even want to have. I don't want to see black people sharing the same status in society as people of my race. I don't want to see black people even having the right to vote, to have a fair chance of influencing the politics in the country that they live. So it's certainly evident, from my research, that there was certainly that difference in terms of the structure of the systems of servitude in African societies traditionally and other parts of the world, along that basis alone. But Brother Dwayne, you touched on an important point, I think, which was how the treatment of the enslaved in African societies was also different, right? In certain places, they had a code that basically established how an enslaved person should be treated. And I just wanted to reference a quote here by Oluda Equiano, who was Igbo. He was taken from a place in what is now Nigeria. What he said from his narrative, he said, I quote, "Indeed, I must acknowledge, in honor of those sable destroyers of human rights, that I never met with any ill treatment or saw any offered to their slaves, except tying them when necessary to keep them from running away." And it must be understood also that Oluda Equiano, he was not writing as just a victim. of the system of slavery, but he was writing as an observer of basically what he experienced in African societies compared to what he experienced in European societies. Equiano's own family owned slaves, and this is how he was able to make these distinctions. He understood the difference between the systems of servitude in his culture, in his community, and by the time he got on the slave ships, he was like, this is not what we're accustomed to as African people. Not at all. At least from his part of the continent, right? Which leads me into another question, Brother Dwayne. My question to you is, did these dynamics, were these dynamics different as you moved from one part of the continent to the next? So you were talking about West Africa. We spoke about the Asante. We spoke about Dahomey, right? And we spoke about also, I believe, a place in Mali. But what about places like, on the east side of the continent? What about places in Central Africa, West Central Africa? We're talking about like kingdoms like Congo, Angola. What about parts of the continent to the south? How did the treatment of enslaved people differ compared to those parts of West Africa that you were referring to?
Yeah, so I'll start with Central Africa, particularly the Congo, because I think much of what I said about the situation in West Africa would also apply to Central Africa. Also applies because that was not a region of Africa that was, very much impacted by the European slave trade, and that was a similar type of system where typically people who were enslaved were war captives or people who had committed a crime, and that was a form of punishment. And within that system as well, as I said, it wasn't. It could be very brutal in certain aspects, but the basic humanity of the enslaved individual was recognized. Now, East Africa is very interesting, and I mentioned one example, Menelik II, whose mother was enslaved. But East Africa is interesting because that region of Africa, when we talk of slavery in East Africa, we're not just talking about whatever indigenous types of systems of slavery were in place, but we're also talking about a region of Africa that was impacted by the Arab slave trade that you mentioned. The Arabs were able to conquer much of East Africa, Egypt. Starting with Egypt, they conquered Egypt, moved down to the Sudan, and the Arab slave trade was. You mentioned it. European slave trade, in the sense that enslaved individuals were integrated into the society to a certain extent. If you accepted Islam, you were part of the Arab society. If you accepted the Arab culture, but it should also be made clear that Arabs also had their own. Certain Arabs also had their own racist views towards African people, and within the Arab world, you do find the same type of perception of Africans being inferior and secondary or lower class form of people, and that definitely influenced the way Arab slave masters treated the enslaved Africans. So we find not only the influence of the Arab slave trade, but also the European slave trade as well. The Portuguese were trading with the Arabs in East Africa, and I think that's an aspect of history not a lot of us are aware of. That some of us from in the diaspora have descendants from East Africa who were also taken as part of the Arab slave trade, and the Arabs working along with the Portuguese. So I think when we talk about the slave trade in Africa, we do tend to think about West Africa and Central Africa because that's where the majority of the Africans who were taken from Africa to the diaspora were brought. But there was a slave trade going on in East Africa, which sent individuals throughout what we call the Middle East now, Western Asia, or what we call the Arab world, and also sent individuals from East Africa to the United States. So that was a region of Africa that was very much also impacted by the slave trade, and there was a cultural impact, because I mentioned our conquest and complete change culture of those countries. One of the things I've written about in my writings is the civil war that took place in the Sudan. Typically, that civil war is often depicted as a war between Arabs and Africans. And I think when we talk about Arabs versus Africans in Sudan, we have to keep in mind that the Arabs that we're talking about, they're actually Arabized Africans. These are people who racially are African, but they've adopted the Arab culture. And the problem in Sudan was that these Arabized Africans in the north were trying to impose Arab culture across the rest of the country. So, as you point out, there was more of a level of integration in Arab societies than there were in European societies in terms of how enslaved Africans were treated, and a result of that has been it's definitely influenced the culture of Africa in a way that we're still seeing the consequences of that across the continent in terms of these wars over different cultural identities, which stem from the fact that Arabs, when they came into Africa, imposed their culture in certain parts of the continent. Now, in terms of South Africa, for my research, I really haven't found too many instances of indigenous forms of slavery or servitude in South Africa. Part of that is because the social structure in a lot of South African societies was a bit different than what you'd find in other parts of Africa. And I mentioned earlier that Walter Rani, in his book, A History of the Upper Guinea Coast, mentions that when Europeans arrived in that region of West Africa, they noticed that there were actually some societies in West Africa that didn't have a system of servitude, didn't have a system of slavery. So we also have to keep in mind that there were parts of Africa that didn't have, any form of servitude, any form of slavery. In those parts of West Africa, typically, if you committed a crime, instead of being enslaved or being reduced to a servant, how it was handled was that you'd pay a fine. So for my research, South Africa seems to be one of those regions in Africa where we don't find an organized or an established system of servitude in which an individual is deprived of their liberty and becomes the property of another individual. I haven't come across that in any of the South African societies that I've researched.
In South Africa?
South Africa.
Okay, yeah. I see. So another question, Brother Dwayne. My question is, how did the transatlantic slave trade, in particular, because we understand the devastation that it caused. I mean, we're talking about upwards of 12 million persons, being removed from the continent and taken into another part of the world, right? How did this process affect the systems of servitude which were practiced traditionally in African societies on the continent? And of course, I would also maybe add to that the dimension of, as you mentioned, Brother Dwayne, the enslavement that was introduced by the Arabs from the north. How did these two systems impact the African traditional systems of servitude?
It was a very big impact. It was like, as I said, it was a very big impact. Especially, I'll start with the European slave trade in West Africa. It was a very huge impact because the European slave trade, one of the things it did was it created an incentive to enslave people and to sell them. So what ended up happening was it actually expanded the practice of slavery in West Africa. And I mentioned societies like the Dahomey and Asante that became very brutal, militarized societies. They were the product of what the slave trade did in West Africa. And something that I show in my writings that Europeans were very much aware of the fact, and Africans themselves at point that because we're offering rewards for captives, it created an incentive for warfare. So what started happening in regions of Africa which were impacted by the slave trade, there'd be frequent wars, frequent conflicts, and the purpose of these conflicts was to acquire captives to sell to Europeans. And when you look through the documents, even Europeans who were involved in the slave trade acknowledged that if Europeans had ceased engaging in the slave trade, it would significantly reduce the warfare in those parts of Africa. So one of the things that happened was a lot of African societies had to become very aggressive and very militarized in order to withstand onslaught of the slave trade. And that had an impact on just the whole structure of the society because, as I said before, in African societies, there was a general feeling of respecting the humanity of individuals who were enslaved. The slave trade reduced captives to being a commodity. So now a lot of African kingdoms at that time would go out and raid villages and attack rival kingdoms solely for the purpose of taking people to sell to the Europeans. So it created that incentive to increase warfare, to increase the practice of slavery. And as I said, it expanded slavery because when you have kingdoms like the Dahomey and Asante that are constantly, going engaging in these raids and engaging in these wars, another purpose that slaves served, aside from being a commodity to sell to the Europeans, another function of the slave was that slaves replenish the population, because if you're sending an army out to go to war, not only are you defeating the enemy and taking captives, you're losing your own people to these conflicts. So kingdoms like Asante and Dahomey, they were actually taking slaves, and one of the reasons why these slaves were being integrated in the society, they were using the slaves to replenish the population. Dahomey, Asante, and other kingdoms that were involved in the slave trade, it's important to understand that not only were they involved in the slave trade in terms of capturing people and selling them, they were losing their own citizens to the slave trade as well. Many of us in diaspora, we are descendants of people from Asante, from Dahomey, from Congo and other kingdoms that were engaged in the slave trade. We come from those same kingdoms. So not only were these kingdoms enslaving and selling other people, but they were having their own people being enslaved and sold. So
that's right.
They had to take these slaves and incorporate them because they needed to replenish the population. In the Congo, for example, Afonso, he stands out as one of the African rulers who stood against the slave trade. And the reason why he did this is because he was concerned that the slave trade was depopulating his kingdom. They were, the Europeans were taking too many of his people, and that became a significant concern of his. So slaves became necessary for replenishing the population. And the other thing that happened as well, I mentioned before, in some West African societies, if you committed a crime, the way it was handled was through a fine. So what happened with the slave trade now was being sold into slavery actually became a punishment in a lot of West African societies. If you committed a crime, the punishment was being sold into slavery, and it became very arbitrary in terms of what type of offenses were deemed so harsh that you need to be sold into slavery. In the history of the Upper Guinea Coast, Walter Ronnie mentions a particular society in West Africa where if a man falls from a tree and dies, the punishment to his family is that they were sold into slavery.
Wow.
So as I said, it was very.
Imagine that, Brother Dwayne. So you're saying if a man is climbing a tree,
fell out of a tree,
he falls and dies, then
his family gets sold into slavery as a punishment for what he did. Yeah, exactly.
That sounds ridiculous to me.
What was happening? Because as I said, the slave trade created an incentive. So now we have African chiefs, African kings who are deciding we're just going to make up arbitrary laws just to create an excuse to sell people into slavery. So, one of the things that Walter points out is that adultery, typically in West Africa, that was dealt with a fine. If you slept with my wife, you pay a fine, give me some money, and that's how it settled. Mm-hmm. With the rise of the Atlantic slave trade, what started happening was that was an offense that you could be sold into slavery. So now if you slept with my wife, I have a right to capture you and sell you into slavery as a form of punishment. So what Walter Ronnie shows in that book is that a lot of crimes which either were settled with a fine or things that weren't crimes that eventually became crimes, they were settled through being sold into slavery. So the slave trade really did radically change the whole structure of West African societies. It created very militarized, aggressive societies.
Right.
African societies with standing armies. Typically, it was very rare in Africa. You didn't have many pre-colonial African societies with standing armies. The Zulus in Southern Africa were one example of an African society that had standing armies. The Dahomey, Asante, and Oyo, all West African societies, all of them had standing armies. And as I said, they were all West African societies. So that really shows the impact that the slave trade had on that region of Africa, that it was very rare to find these level of militarized societies in Africa. And when we do find them, most of them are located in West Africa during that period of the slave
Right.
trade. So it
Right.
changed, the society in terms of making the societies more militarized. Warfare expanded. Wars were more frequent. Wars became more destructive. And
Mm-hmm.
again, Europeans themselves point out the fact that African wars became more destructive.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And
As a
as I
matter of
said,
fact,
it also changed.
yeah. There's a quote I have here.
Yeah,
British slave trader Robert Norris. He was one of those guys who basically was an apologist for slavery and the slave trade. He was one of those guys
yeah,
who basically he fought the abolitionists tooth and nail because he knew that um, the more that people began to believe that the slave trade actually was brutal, it was something that African people in their societies were not accustomed to, but which had actually been imposed upon them, and had disastrous effects. Um, Now, Robert Norris, he wrote the wars which have always existed in Africa have no connection at all with the slave trade. That's what he wrote. He also wrote that basically he believed African people had this um, inherent uh, love for war and for um, basically destruction. So this is what he said. Quote: He said the turbulent and irascible disposition of a Negro prompts him to harass and dispute with his neighbor upon the most trivial provocations, lured by the love of plunder before he ever saw a European commodity. This is what he said. So brother Dwayne, you mentioned that these specific kingdoms, or rather empires, is what they were at this point in time. Um, they had standing armies. Would you say that these armies did exist prior to contact with the Europeans? That African people had been engaging in war with each other all this time, and maybe it was the incentive, like you said, that the Europeans introduced to capture more of their enemies and to sell them into slavery that just kind of escalated those conflicts.
yeah. Yeah, as I said, one of the people involved in the slave trade that comes to mind, who actually pointed this out, John Newton. He was involved in the slave trade, and then eventually he realized it was wrong and became an opponent of the slave trade. And he pointed
Mm-hmm.
out that the majority of the wars in Africa would actually stop if Europeans stopped buying captives. So this is something that
Mm.
Europeans recognize, and even Africans themselves. Walter Rani shows in that same book that they keep referencing that when African rulers were interviewed about the wars that they engaged in, they admit that the wars they engaged in were solely for the purpose of acquiring slaves, and that if there was no incentive to acquire these slaves and to sell them into captivity, they wouldn't have a reason to engage in the war. So the historical record is pretty clear on the fact that the slave trade increased the number of wars that
Mm-hmm.
were being fought in Africa. And to get to the second part of your question about the Arab slave trade and how that impacted Africa, that's a little bit more difficult to assess because Arabs were able to dominate certain parts of Africa, mainly North Africa. But when they get into what we call sub-Saharan Africa, although I don't really care for that term, but
Yeah.
Black Africa,
I prefer to
because
use the term Africa south of the Sahara.
yeah, yes, I don't particularly care for those terms, but as I said, Arabs established domination in North Africa. Now,
Mm-hmm.
Arabs weren't really able to, establish domination over Black African society, so it wasn't the same type of situation with the Europeans. The Arabs weren't that powerful, and that's why I think the impact of the Arab slave trade in Africa is unique in the sense that a lot of parts of Africa, Arabs weren't able to conquer outright. But what they were able to do is to expand the influence through the culture, through their religion. So there's a lot of parts of Africa that became Arabized due to the conflict, the contact with Arabs. And
Right.
as I said, there's parts of Africa that are still dealing with a lot of those conflicts. The Sudan, for example, since the Sudan became independent, it's been an identity struggle within that nation, and obviously South Sudan even ended up becoming independent at some point because of that identity crisis. And we see in West Africa a lot of Islamic extremist groups that are popping up now that are trying to impose a very dogmatic fundamentalist approach to Islam and to a type of Arabized culture. They're using violent force to impose that across West Africa. So, to me, when I think of the impact of the Arab slave trade, I think of the impact on African culture, African society. This introduction of a very, as I said, fundamentalist, very dogmatic approach to religion. So it wasn't just that Arabs introduced Islam into Africa, but a lot of parts of Africa were introduced to a very fundamentalist type of approach, a type of approach that sought to eradicate traditional African culture, and we're still seeing those conflicts playing out in Africa today. And the other aspect of the Arab impact, and I mentioned before that Arabs did have their own racist views towards African people as well. And two places where I've written about this is in Zanzibar, which is an island in East Africa. There was a whole revolution in Zanzibar in which Africans rose up to overthrow the Arabs. And the reason for that was because Arab domination over African people was very oppressive and very racist. Zanzibar was a society where even after slavery was outlawed, Africans were still treated as second-class citizens by the Arab rulers. Wow. So there was a whole revolution to overthrow Arab rule in Zanzibar. And I've also written about Africans in Iraq. As we mentioned, Iraq was one of the places where enslaved Africans were taken to during the Arab slave trade. And Africans in Iraq today are still fighting for equal rights because they're still treated as second-class citizens. They're still looked down upon by the Arabs in Iraq. So within the Arab world, we still see Africans struggling with the stigma of racism. And even though Arab slavery offered some level of social mobility to enslaved Africans who adopted the Arab culture and Arab religion, there still is a lot of prejudice against African people. Recently, my most recent book that I published, I wrote about an example where Nigerian women who went to Saudi Arabia, to visit Mecca during the pilgrimage, they were detained and then sent back to Nigeria because they didn't have male relatives accompanying them. Now, these were Muslim women coming from Nigeria, but because the culture that they came from in Nigeria was such that they felt, comfortable as women traveling to Mecca on their own without being accompanied by a male relative.
Right.
They did that, and they were essentially punished by the Arabs in Saudi Arabia because now the Arabs practice a different type of culture as it relates to how women are treated. So what that demonstrates is that even though Africans adopt Islam and might share the same religion with Arabs, there's still this cultural conflict because Arabs still look down upon African culture, because African culture is still very different from the Arab culture. And as I said, because of that, now we find very radical Islamic groups that seek to completely eradicate the African culture to not only instill the religion of Islam, but to instill Arab culture. And that's the legacy of the Arab slave trade. But as I said, it's a bit different because unlike Europeans who were able to colonize the entire continent, the Arabs weren't really able to establish that level of direct control over the continent. So much of the Arab impact in Africa has been the cultural impact.
Wow. That was I think that was definitely a very good picture of what was taking place on the continent, how these dynamics were different when it came to the Europeans on the continent, their own systems of enslavement, which, like you said, brother Dwayne, had escalated a lot of the conflicts, even those that had been pre-existing, and had basically caused new conflicts, to arise. I would look at some of the empires like Dahomey. I would imagine they made new enemies, right? And then you spoke about the Arab system of slavery and how that was different from the traditional forms. And you spoke about the gender distinctions rather, that were made in that society, which was not what African people were accustomed to. What about in the Americas? What about across the diaspora? Um, African people practicing um, forms of servitude, which in some way might have been some kind of a carryover from traditional systems on the continent, um, or might have even been influenced by um, Europeans and their systems of enslavement. I think about, for example, maroon communities. I think about not just in the Caribbean, but also, and by the way, the Caribbean, a lot of times we hear the term maroon, immediately what comes to mind is like Jamaica, you know, um, where my people are from. But, and by the way, I just recently learned that one of my ancestors was a maroon on my father's side, and that was a pleasant surprise for me. Um, but again, we don't necessarily think about maroons in that they existed in places like um, South America, right? They existed in places like Central America. You talk about like Mexico, for example, with Gaspar Yango. You talk about in North America, we had the Great Dismal Swamp. In the Carolinas, Virginia, there were maroon communities there as well. And if we want to go deeper into it, we can even talk about Florida, where they had what were referred to as the Black Seminoles. Um, these communities as well are part of, I think, that larger world of what we would consider to be the Maroons. But now, Brother Dwayne, I just wonder if maybe you're familiar with some of the systems of servitude which existed in these communities, and maybe how they might have been influenced in some way by the European systems of slavery.
Yeah, that's not an aspect of Maroon society that has ever really come up in my research in terms of servitude. I know, from some of the studies I've done with the Jamaican Maroons that they did have a system of servitude. Now, in terms of whether or not that was influenced by the African system of servitude, or whether or not that was influenced by the fact that Jamaica was a slave society, at the time it's very difficult to really make that distinction. But as I said, when we talk about Maroon societies, that's not an aspect of Maroon society that's come up a lot in my research. But what you're saying is definitely true, that there were Maroons across the Americas, because a Maroon was essentially someone who just ran away from slavery and joined a society of runaway slaves, society that was independent. So that happened across the Americas. The Jamaican Maroons obviously are the most prominent because of their history of fighting the British and signing a treaty with the British. But Maroons in Haiti, it was Dirty Bookman. He was part of a Maroon society when he initiated the Haitian Revolution, and Maroons were a big part of the revolution in Haiti. In Grenada, Julian Fedon was known for leading a massive slave uprising in Grenada, and Maroons are part of that as well. So across the Americas, Maroons are part of, we see Maroons being part of this massive resistance against slavery. In terms of, in terms of your question, yeah, as I said, from my research, I haven't really found too much information on you know, uh, practices of servitude in Maroon societies. But I'm interested, if that's something that you've come across in your research, and if so, what did you find?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked, Brother Dwayne. Yes, in studying, I haven't necessarily been able to get information on that in regards to the Jamaican Maroons. However, I have studied uh, the Maroons of Saint Vincent, who at the time were referred to as the Black Caribs. In Saint Vincent, there were two communities which were referred to as Carib communities. There's one side of the island which they refer to the people as the yellow or the red Caribs, and then the other side, after a series of wars that took place between the Caribs who were understood to have descended from African people who escaped from shipwrecks on the coast and who also escaped from plantations, those African people were referred to as Black Caribs. At times they had intermarried with the indigenous populations there, but because of the fact that they just couldn't seem to get along with these indigenous people, they had gone through a series of wars, so they formed their own communities. In these communities, what I found is they did in fact practice systems of servitude, but it was very different. It was radically different from that practiced by Europeans. In fact, based on our discussion, Brother Dwayne, it was more close to what we found in places on the continent, in Africa. It was also very close to what the indigenous people of the Americas practiced in regards to slavery. Their traditional systems, in which, of course, it was not race based. That's not the way that they thought. It was a system where, again, there was an aspect of social mobility. You talk about in some of the wars that took place, you had black chief, a black Carib chief. I believe his name was Joseph, who basically was the head of the resistance struggle against the British, I believe it was. And these Caribs, who were also referred to as Garifuna, they allied at times with the French. So their systems of servitude were such that with the red or yellow Caribs, as they were referred, they did at times demonstrate a sort of I want to refer to it as prejudice, because of course there were certain influences from the colonizers in which the colonizers tended to favor these Caribs over the ones who they understood to be African people, because they wanted to assert their own power, with the knowledge that they had persons from their plantations who were enslaved, and as they came into contact with these black Caribs, it was empowering to them, and they started to think, hey, there's a chance that we too can be free. We too can set up our own communities, and we can live independent of these Europeans. And so that was all a part of this dynamic. One thing that stood out to me, Brother Dwayne, is that the black Caribs, even though they too had African heritage, when African people escaped the plantations and came into their communities, they were actually enslaved by the black Caribs. So it was a situation in which you had African people who had enslaved other African people, even though both of these two communities had been they had the same goals, which was basically freedom, independence from the European colonial powers. However, again, this system of slavery was not a system of oppression as we know it under the European system. It was not one in which it was chattel slavery and you and your descendants were slaves for life. There was no way of advancing. You can be killed. You were just kind of like basically an animal. It was not that kind of a situation. Now, in the Seminole communities as well, I'm referring to them as Seminole, but actually what they were, a more accurate description would be Gullah. A lot of the African people who had escaped from the northern regions of the United States and came down into what was previously Spanish territory, and came to live among the Seminoles. A lot of these people were Gullah, and they adopted some of the traditional practices of these Native American communities. They also established their own villages Um, in these environments, there were African people who, they built themselves to a level where they were very successful within that society. There were European visitors who came in and they saw that these people, they were landowners, they were farmers, and a lot of times the yield of their crops and their livestock was much more bountiful than even the native people themselves. So in these communities, there was also an element of slavery. There was also an element of servitude. But again, just like I was saying about the Carib communities, the Garifuna, you see a very similar picture in which it's not a sort of oppression to the point of European practice where they consider this person to be basically, a nobody, someone who you can exploit to the fullest extent. That simply was not the case. And as a matter of fact, let me just add to that. During the Seminole Wars, as they were referred to, I'm sure you're familiar with some of that history, Brother Dwayne, and especially during the time of President Andrew Jackson. The Europeans and the white American soldiers who were fighting in this war, they noted the great presence of African people in levels of leadership within this series of conflicts. And I think that is, again, it points to the fact that there was that social upward mobility. There was the element of, advancement within these societies. And it was not such a rigid structure like that we find in European societies. All right. So, did you have any thoughts on that, Brother Dwayne?
Yeah, that's fascinating. I've heard about the Maroons and St. Vincent, but that's not really history that that I looked into very
Hmm.
much. So definitely learned a lot from what you were saying just now. Now the Seminole Wars, I'm much more familiar with that, and I've written about that a little bit in my own work. But yeah, as I said, definitely the situation in St. Vincent. That's not something I've studied very much. So
Hmm.
very very informative.
Yes, yes. I think it came as a surprise to me as well. It's something we just don't hear about these things, right? We don't learn about these things. You're not going to find these things in a school textbook, right? They're not going to teach these things, not even in some university courses either. These are some of the facts of our history that we have to be taking the initiative on. We have to do this research for ourselves. And sometimes it means we have to really dig and dig and dig. We have to, really hunt down some of these books, right, Brother Dwayne? We have to get into some of these archives. I'm telling you, I mean, some of this history, I mean, is really is hidden. It's deep in the museums and the libraries, and I think it's on us really as researchers, as students of history, to do our due diligence in searching for these answers that we so desperately need. And from this history, there's so much that we can learn. So we're going to go to a short break. For those of you who are watching us live on Facebook or on YouTube, once again, we are here at our first biannual Research Rumble. The topic that we're discussing today is African participation and resistance in the time of the slave trades. I am your host, Omri Koch, with Black Researchers United. I'm here with Brother Dwayne Wong Omowale, Pan-African writer and researcher of the Omowale Pan-African Digital Library. Brother Dwayne, he has written a series of books. I have two here with me today. This one here, Essays Towards Restoring the African Mind. And the second one I have here, it's called One Caribbean and Other Essays. Alright, so again, we're going to head to a short break. For those who are watching, you can leave a comment if you have any questions for our guest, Brother Dwayne. We're going to be monitoring the comments within the next 5 minutes. If you have any questions, just drop them there in the chat, and we will respond. Thank you so much, and stay tuned for our Q&A. Welcome back, everyone. We are here again at our first biannual Research Rumble. This is your host, Omri Coke, with Black Researchers United. And I'm joined here, once again, with Brother Dwayne Wong Omowale, Pan-African writer and researcher with the Omowale Pan-African Digital Library. So we've been here discussing the subject African participation and resistance in the time of slavery. The question that we are addressing, the main question, is how did traditional systems of servitude in African societies differ from those practiced in other communities? Now, we just went to break, and we did have a question from one of our viewers. It is actually from Brother Myri from our previous discussions. Brother Myri, he submitted a question, and I think it's a very good one. The question that Brother Myri is asking us is, he's saying, can you talk about the slave soldier systems? So the slave soldier systems, that it seems would be in regards to systems of servitude on the continent of Africa, which involved the integration of enslaved persons into the militaries, the armies of African societies, African communities. What can we say about that, Brother Dwayne?
That was being asked, and as I pointed out before, African societies did have various ways in which people who were enslaved were actually integrated into various aspects of the society. And military service was one of them. I mentioned the Home and Asante as two examples of very militarized African societies, and part of the militarization of those societies were people who were enslaved were utilized in the military, but they certainly weren't the only examples in West Africa of situations in which people who were enslaved made up a significant portion of the military. And I mentioned earlier Sakura, who was one of the rulers of Mali. He was a military commander who managed to seize power. So what he shows is that there were examples in West Africa in which people who were enslaved not only were in the military, but were in very prestigious, high-ranking positions within the military. And so go back to the original topic, I think that's certainly one area where we see a difference between how slaves were treated in Africa compared to slavery in the United States, because certainly, but I said United States, but we could span this broadly throughout the Americas, but certainly we don't see any example where in the Americas an enslaved African would be made a military commander of any type of army. Certainly enslaved Africans weren't being armed in any large numbers. And when we go through the history, particularly the history in the United States, there was a consistent concern about arming Africans to fight in certain wars. During the American Revolutionary War, there were certain people who were very apprehensive over the idea of arming Africans to go fight the British. So whereas in African societies, there was a regular practice of taking people who were enslaved and putting them in the military, having them fight wars.
Brother Dwayne, I think your mic, your volume is cutting out there.
I was cutting out. Is it good now?
Okay, yeah. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So what I was saying is that whereas African societies, there was a practice of taking people who were enslaved and utilizing them in the military and even making them military commanders. In the Americas, there was a real concern about arming slaves and putting them in those sort of positions because of the constant concern of slave rebellions, which happened quite frequently throughout the Americas.
I see. So that concern, Brother Dwayne, would have been something that concerned the Europeans, or something that concerned the African, the African elites, maybe in African societies.
Oh no, yeah, the Europeans.
Okay.
Interestingly, the African elites in those societies, that from what I could gather from my research, they didn't seem particularly concerned about massive slave uprisings. For example, Sakura, he did seize power, through was more or less a coup, but that wasn't a massive slave uprising. This was a particular individual who was, as I said, in a high-ranking position in the military, seizing power. So within African societies, we don't really see too many situations in which people who are enslaved are rising up against enslaved masters. And I think a reason for that goes back to the point I made before about the fact that people who were enslaved in those societies were treated with a certain level of humanity, which was lacking in the Americas. And there was a certain level of social mobility, but in the Americas, those opportunities weren't available to not only enslaved Africans, but even free African people. So there was more of a likelihood of rebellion on the slave plantations in the Americas than in any of the slave systems in Africa.
Wow. Wow. I would say that certainly does, and that certainly does answer the question in regards to, I would say that the continent there, um, the slave society, the slave soldier systems. That's something that I'm not so much familiar with in my research. Um, I will say that slave soldier systems, that does seem to be something, I think, which we would find more so in the northern parts of the continent, um, especially as the Arab um, system of slavery um, was introduced into some of these traditional societies. There were certainly evidences of enslaved persons uh, basically being employed into all these different um, areas of society, not just domestically, right, but also in the fields as well. A lot of people are not familiar with the fact that there were plantations in Africa, just like how there were here in the Americas. They also had plantation systems. Not so much. This is not so much something that African people had instituted, but it was something that you found in some Arab communities, some Muslim communities, and you found also to some extent in other parts of Africa, in particular in the West. So I think in terms of like the militaries, the soldiers, enslaved people being taken into these militaries, I think that's certainly a topic that deserves further research on my part, and I'm sure that those who are viewing as well, maybe that's a subject that we can certainly explore during another discussion. Maybe we might have another Rumble that is dedicated to that subject. What do you think, Brother Dwayne?
Yeah, I think it's a very fascinating subject, and as I said before, it's interesting too because looking at it from the perspective of slavery in the Americas, it would almost seem counterintuitive to be training enslaved people and putting them in military service because obviously that runs the risk of a rebellion. Yet that's precisely what happened in many African societies. So I think it'd be a very interesting topic to discuss. And I mentioned before about Rome and slavery in Rome. That was a very significant issue in Rome, facing slave rebellions. Spartacus, definitely is the most famous leader of a slave uprising in Rome, but there were numerous examples of slave uprisings in Rome. So, as I said, I think it would be a very fascinating topic to explore and to contrast how, this whole discussion has been a contrast of slavery in Africa compared to other societies. I think that would definitely be an interesting area to contrast as well. How did Western societies view arming slaves versus how did African societies view arming slave populations? And I mentioned Rome, the Spartans as well. The Spartans were also a society that was very much concerned about the possibility that the people that they were enslaving could uprise against them. So the Spartans didn't arm the people that they enslaved, they didn't train them within the military. So I think it would be a very fascinating discussion to explore.
Mm-hmm. Yes, especially considering the fact that in European societies, you did have this on some occasions, and I think in particular it would have been in times of war, in which one European army was going to war against another European army. If you look at, for example, the American Revolution, um, the Revolutionary War, right? You had, I believe it was Lord Dunmore who made that proclamation from the British side to say, hey, all of you who come to fight with us, who are in American slavery, if you fight for the British, then we're going to give you your freedom, right? And
Yep.
a lot of uh, enslaved people, a lot of black people went to the British side to fight against, the United States, or what we now know to be the United States, right? Um, so it's just one example of a case in which the enslavers saw this as a sort of opportunity for them, um, rather than, like you're saying, Brother Dwayne, a kind of a liability of sorts. And I think a lot of this happened in the Caribbean as well. In some places where the British and the French were at war, either side saw it to their advantage to arm enslaved people. Even in places like Jamaica with the Maroons, you had the British recruiting, Maroon warriors to fight on their behalf, and even equipping them as militia to hunt down some of um, the people who had escaped from the plantations, the runaways. So, I think that's certainly a topic we need to explore further. What was the view on this from the African side? How did African elites or African monarchs view the the persons in their society who were basically on the bottom level, who were in those positions of servitude, in regards to military service? I think that's definitely a topic that we need to explore some more.
You were mentioning the Revolutionary War and how certain Africans actually went to fight on the side of the British against
Mm-hmm.
the Americans. And I don't know how many people are aware of this. I'm sure you might have come across this, but one of those individuals was one of George Washington's slaves, Harry Washington. So I remember when I
Mm.
first found out about that, I thought that was very interesting, and it's never anything I've seen mentioned in school whenever the topic of the American Revolution comes up. But yeah, one of George Washington's own slaves defected from the American side and fought alongside the British, against the Americans, and that's, to me, it's very fascinating. And what's especially fascinating is he ended up in Sierra Leone. So, he fought against his former the slave master, and he ended up dying a free man in
Wow.
Sierra Leone. And George Washington put it in his will that after he and his wife died, he'll all of his slaves would then get freedom. So I thought it was interesting that this man Harry Washington took freedom into his own hands, and rather than waiting until George Washington said he could be free, he decided to take up a gun and go fight George Washington to get his freedom. So, yeah, I
Yeah.
mentioned earlier the reason why I write so many books in African history is because stories like that are very fascinating to me. I think need to be more widely known and not taught in school. And unfortunately, I don't think enough of our people really understand and appreciate our history.
I certainly agree, Brother Dwayne. I certainly agree. There's so much that we don't learn, in schools. So much that we don't learn growing up, which I think is very essential for us to understand. And that brings me to a very, very good question, Brother Dwayne, which is, with all this information, given all this knowledge that we gain from this subject um, about these differences between African societies and European societies, and given the fact that a lot of us in the diaspora today, myself included, we are pretty much raised in a society which is, um, for a greater part of it, it is basically anti-black. A lot of the things that this society tends to associate, I think, with um, progress. A lot of it tends to be um, to the detriment of people at the bottom, right? During this history that we're speaking about, the people at the bottom would have been the enslaved people. Their descendants today continue to face some of the same uh, sort of dimensions of oppression that our ancestors were facing during this time. So my question today, Brother Dwayne, what are some of the lessons we can take from this that we can apply to our present circumstances?
One of the reasons why I'm very fascinated by this particular topic, this particular period of African history, the period of the slave trade, there are so many different lessons we can learn in terms of what African states did wrong and how we can improve on those things. One of the things that I always look at as a Pan-Africanist, the disunity of Africa at the time was definitely benefits for Europeans, because Europeans were able to exploit different rivalries and different conflicts among the African states. They were able to, in some situations, even start controversies. And very often Europeans would take sides. So if two Africans were fighting with each other, it was very common that one European power would side with one African state and another European power might side with the other state. And what that ensured was that regardless of who won, the Europeans got what they wanted. They got the captives, because the war just produced these captives, and in return for the captives, the Europeans would give Africans these weapons. And when we look at the state of African people globally, we have to ask ourselves, are we really in a much different situation than what our ancestors were in? Because we're still very much a disunited people. We're still a people who are much more willing to, I think, fight wars against each other rather than uniting towards a common goal and towards a common objective. And the reason why I particularly mentioned the trade between Africans and Europeans, and how Africans use that to acquire weapons, is because globally, when we look at the state of violence against African people in the United States, we see issues with gang violence in our communities across the Caribbean. Same thing. There's a lot of issue with violence and guns. In Africa, we see entire civil wars being fought across the continent since decolonization in the 1960s and 70s. And when you look at these conflicts, these are conflicts and situations in which African people are killing each other using weapons that we don't even produce. These are weapons that come from outside of our communities. So we have a situation where all across the world, African people are still engaged in these violent conflicts against each other, utilizing weapons that flow into our communities from the outside. So, when I look at that, to me, it's not just, when we talk about the slave trade, we're not just talking about history, we're talking about a process that began centuries ago that we still see continuing to play out in our communities. We still see situations where we allow outside forces to come into our communities, exploit our divisions, flood guns and other types of destructive things into our communities, and we use these things to further destroy each other, right, rather than uniting towards a common cause. And I think slave trade, Europeans were able to benefit from the disunity of the various African kingdoms, because the African rulers at the time, for the most part, adopted a mentality of, if I can protect my people and I can protect my kingdom, I don't necessarily care about the other kingdom. As a matter of fact, I might have had a war that predated, or a conflict that predated the European a rival. So I want to destroy these people. I wanted to go wipe out the kingdom, sell the sell the people into
Mm-hmm.
slavery. And I think the African rulers at the time, for the most part, didn't really appreciate the type of destructive force that they were participating in. I don't think they appreciated the fact that the slave trade was really the first step towards the underdevelopment of Africa. You mentioned Walter in his book how Europe underdeveloped Africa.
That's
He
right.
spends most of the time
It is.
analyzing the period of colonialism in Africa. But in that very book, he starts with the slave trade. He starts with the slave trade as the process of underdevelopment. And he points out not only did the slave trade depopulate many parts of Africa, but I mentioned the Dahomey. The Dahomey began to suffer from severe famines because of the slave trade, because the Dahomey was in a constant cycle of having to wage wars, and that drains on a society, that drains the economy of the society. So slave trade was really that period where African society began to underdevelop, and it was the beginning of that period in which Europeans would establish a global economy built on the exploitation of African people globally,
Right.
African people both in the diaspora and African people on the continent. So I say all this to make the point that when we're talking about this, we're not talking about history. We're talking about a process that began centuries ago that we're still dealing with the consequences of. We're still dealing with the division. As I said, we're still dealing with the fact that we allow other people to flood guns into our communities, and then we use these weapons to further
Mm.
destroy ourselves. And above all, we're still dealing with the legacy of slavery. This whole time we've been talking about indigenous systems of slavery in Africa, and I think it's important to point out that slavery still does exist in many parts of Africa. And I have a good friend of
Yep.
mine who's a Pan Africanist who's done work in West Africa to put an end to a lot of these indigenous systems of slavery, which still exist in Africa and are still oppressing people in Africa. And I think one of the reasons why this continues to be a problem is because of the underdevelopment of Africa. The centuries of slave trade, the centuries of colonialism,
Mm.
really stifled Africa's ability to develop and to move forward. So we're still struggling with the legacy of things that were problems centuries ago that I think had Africa not been as devastated as it had been due to European influence, he probably would have been better positioned to really address these issues such as how do we go about taking care of slavery in African societies. And the other thing that also needs to be kept in mind as well, not only does slavery still exist in African societies, slavery still exists in the United States. A lot of people who don't
Mm-hmm.
actually read the American Constitution aren't aware that the 13th Amendment has a provision that still allows for slavery right here in the United States. So not only are we still dealing with the existence of slavery as an issue that needs to be addressed on the African continent,
Mm-hmm.
slavery is an issue here in the United States that needs to be addressed as well because it still continues. And I do remember you mentioned that book, The New Jim Crow, yeah, by
Yep. Yep.
Michelle
That's the one.
Alexander.
That's the one I was reaching for. The
Yeah,
New Jim Crow
yeah.
by Michelle Alexander. Yep.
Wow.
Yep. This book
Yeah.
talks all about it.
Anyone who hasn't read that book or is not familiar with her work, I would really recommend it because she really does break down the fact that that 13th Amendment that many of us think was the amendment that ended slavery in America
Mm-hmm.
really reinvented slavery in such a way that slavery still continues, but it continues with a legal justification. So, as I said, none of these things should be thought of as just history. These are all issues that we're dealing with today: the issue of disunity, the issue of the destruction of a community, the issue of the continued enslavement and exploitation of African people. So, in
Mm.
closing, that's the message that I want to get across. That in studying history, we're not just studying facts and dates and people and things that happened way back then. We're studying a continual process, and by understanding the history of the slave trade in Africa, we're understanding the beginning of the process, the beginning of all the struggles that African people endure, where did that start from? So to me, I think we have to understand where it started from. We have to study the start point before we can fully understand the problem. And without fully understanding the problem, we can't come to a solution.
Yes, sir. That is Brother Dwayne Wong Omowale. We are here at our Research Rumble. For those of you who are just tuning in, the topic that we have been discussing here: African participation and resistance in the time of the slave trades. The question we have been addressing for this round of our discussion, our Research Rumble, is how did traditional systems of servitude in African societies differ from those practiced in other communities? This has been a very, very deep discussion. I can say for a fact, Brother Dwayne, that I have learned quite a lot in the course of our discourse here. There's so much that we still need to explore on this subject, and there's so much that we can take away as far as the lessons of this history. So for those of you who are watching and you just might still have some questions, or you're just tuning in after the live stream, feel free to send them, and we will address those questions. You can send them to our email address for Black Researchers United. That email is bru@afrologia.org. That's bru@afrologia.org. And we will forward some of those questions to Brother Dwayne in regards to this question, and we should be able to deliver an answer for you based on our research. So, this once again has been our first biannual Research Rumble. I'm your host, Omri Koch, joined by Brother Dwayne Wong Omowale. Next time we will have a open session Q&A. Any questions that you have had in the course of our discussions, feel free to join us on that next session, and we will address your questions. For those of you who have done research on this subject and have some familiarity with it, you can also send us an email with some of your references, some of just your background on this topic, and we'll be more than welcome to invite you to be a part of this event. So, Brother Dwayne, once again, it's been a pleasure. It's been great to have you join us. So this is just a sample of the work that Brother Dwayne has done. We have the book here, Essays Towards Restoring the African Mind, and we have another book here, One Caribbean and Other Essays. These are, I think, a great starting point for those of you who are trying to learn a little bit about Brother Dwayne's research, his expertise, and you can also visit his website. He has a developing archive of some of the reference materials that he is using. It's the Omowale Pan-African Digital Library. So thanks again, Brother Dwayne. Any final thoughts as we close?
I think this has been a very very fun discussion for me. I've learned a lot as well, and I hope viewers who have watched this discussion have taken away a lot of new information, things that they might not have thought about before, and new perspectives that they might have not considered as well. And I want to thank you for inviting me on and having this discussion.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. So until next time, we will meet again. Have a great one, Brother Dwayne.
You too. Thank you.
All right.